Hello and welcome to another one of our Brexit Explained videos. In this one we're having a look at how Johnson might be able to get out of the mess he's currently in. As we've explained in our previous videos, anti-No Deal MPs have passed the Ben Bill. This is an act which compels Boris to go and ask the EU for an extension. Unfortunately for Boris, he's campaigned on the promise of leaving the EU on the 31st of October, no ifs, no buts. So understandably, he said that he'd rather be dead in a ditch rather than ask for an extension. So, what are Boris's options now? Before we answer that question, I'd like to super quickly shout out our merch store. We have a bunch of new designs, including our new Fuck Fake News shirt and a new 10-year version of our Order shirt.
Wait a minute. I couldn't care less whether you like it or not.
I couldn't give a flying flamingo what your view is. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Find all of those, as well as some of our old designs and our new women's t-shirts over on the merch store. There's a link to that in the description below. So after a bit of pondering, we think that Boris has 8 options of how he can take things forward, and most of them aren't ideal. The first and most obvious one is to just bite the bullet and ask for an extension. He could hope that the EU decides not to grant the extension, or that voters will realise that it wasn't his choice and stick with the Conservatives at the next election. Realistically though, the EU is probably going to give the UK an extension, and Conservative voters will likely flock to the Brexit party, resulting in the Conservatives getting hammered in a November election. This is why Johnson would probably rather die in a ditch than ask for an extension, because it would probably both ruin his political career and the Conservative Party. So if that's not appealing to him, and why would it be, there's a second option which has been floated by some Brexiteers. This option is to still call the election before October 31st, using a one-line bill. Johnson tried to call an election last week and on Monday night, but according to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, he needed 2/3 of MPs to agree to it. Labour refused to back the motion, so he fell well short of the 2/3 required on both occasions. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have any chance. If he were to try and call an election via a bill, he would only need a simple majority. The bill would read something like, notwithstanding the Fixed Term Parliament Act, there will be a general election on the 15th of October. This bill effectively overwrites the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and if it passed with a simple majority, he could ignore the 2/3 rule. This means that Boris will be able to have a general election and still campaign on his no ifs, no buts platform, promising to deliver Brexit by the 31st if Brexit voters give him a parliamentary majority. This sounds like a good idea, but given that Johnson's majority now stands at -45, it isn't guaranteed. Even if there's enough SNP and Labour rebels to get the simple majority required, the bill would still be subject to amendments. That means that anti-No Deal MPs could still change the date of the election, or maybe even go further and add other amendments, doing things like lowering the voting age to 16, which could really hurt the Conservative Party. So again, this isn't a great outcome for Johnson. The third outcome would be for Johnson to hold a no-confidence vote in himself. According to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, if a simple majority of MPs vote for a motion to express no confidence in the Prime Minister, it triggers a 2-week grace period, during which some other coalition of MPs can try and form a government. If no government is formed in this time, Johnson could then ask for an election. However, the act that compels MPs to ask for an extension would still be in play. So Johnson would have to get an election in before the 31st if he wants to stick to his promise of the UK leaving before November. However, he's running out of time to do this. According to current legislation, any general election needs a minimum of 5 weeks for campaigning. Given that Parliament was prorogued last night and won't be back till mid-October, there's no way there's going to be time for him to get a general election done by the 31st. Also, there was always a chance that Jeremy Corbyn would be able to form a government during that 2-week grace period, and that government would be able to ask for an extension. Basically, this plan also doesn't work very well for Johnson. The fourth option would be to send a temporary caretaker Prime Minister to ask for the extension, in the hope that this looks better than Johnson asking for one himself. For example, Johnson could let somebody like Matt Hancock, who's already not particularly popular with Brexiteers, be Prime Minister for the day, and then send him off to the EU to ask for an extension. This way, the media is filled with lots of pictures of ex-Remainer Hancock undermining his Brexiteer credentials, and hopefully Johnson could save some face. Once the extension's agreed, Johnson could then come back and be Prime Minister, and say he didn't technically ask for an extension. This obviously isn't a great strategy. While Johnson himself doesn't go and ask for an extension, he will have broken his no ifs, no buts promise, and it will be the Conservative Party who asks for an extension nonetheless. so the chances are they'd still get hammered at the next election. The fifth option is an idea that's been going around Westminster amongst Brexiteer MPs, and it's a little more creative than the last four. The idea is to send the letter asking for the extension, and then immediately send another letter essentially saying, actually, I didn't mean what I just said. According to Brexiteers pushing this idea, it would be legal because Boris would have fulfilled his obligations of the Act in sending the letter asking for the extension. The Act doesn't say that he can't send another letter. Unfortunately for them, Lord Sumption and Lord Falconer, two of the most senior figures in UK law, have said that it would still be illegal. That's because the statutory purpose of the letter is to ask for an extension, and any attempt to undermine or contradict the statutory purpose is illegal. The sixth option is even more creative. Some Brexiteers have suggested using the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, which says in a national emergency, the government can repeal legislation without the full support of Parliament. Johson could therefore declare a national emergency and then repeal the act which compels him to ask for an extension. Again though, this is legally difficult. Most senior lawyers seem to think that it will be struck down, because the courts would rule that there's no national emergency, just a political controversy. Also, these powers could be vetoed by Parliament under the terms of the Act. That's because Parliament needs to express its support within 7 days, even if it's prorogued. But more fundamentally, these sort of reserved powers should only really be used in actual serious emergencies, because they basically turn the government and the PM into an unaccountable dictatorship. This is why the Civil Contingencies Act has been roundly criticised since it came into force in 2004. The seventh option would be just not to do it. There have been leaks of Conservative MP WhatsApp groups in which they suggest just this, that Johson basically pretend that the act never happened. This would obviously be 100% illegal. Any Prime Minister that doesn't obey the law commits the crime of misconduct in a public office, under the Criminal Law Act of 1977. And if Johson did try to ignore a court ruling on this, he'd also be guilty of contempt of court. If he did this, he could and probably would go to jail, which is completely mental. And I know we've said this a lot, but this is millions of times more mental than anything we've said before. Also, there still might be an extension. Lord Sumption has said that a civil servant could act as de facto Prime Minister and send the letter, if it was authorised by a court. The eighth and final option would be for Boris to resign. We've left this one till last because it's the most complicated and ambiguous, but try and stay with us on this one. Basically, Johson could try and resign as Prime Minister, and advise the Queen to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. This would force Corbyn to ask for the extension. This wouldn't be the same as when Theresa May resigned. When May resigned, she basically resigned as leader of the Conservative Party. She continued to be Prime Minister until the leadership election was over, when she handed the reins over to Johson. Johson wouldn't be trying to resign as party leader, he'd be trying to resign as Prime Minister. And this is a lot harder than it actually sounds. Because the UK doesn't have a written constitution, and lots of political powers still reside in the Queen, there always needs to be a Prime Minister to advise her on political decisions, and the Prime Minister is appointed by the Queen. This means that Johson can't just resign, he needs the Queen to sign off on it. And the Queen would only ever sign off on it if there's another Prime Minister in waiting. That's because there always needs to be a Prime Minister in place to take the political weight off her shoulders. So to solve this problem, Johson could advise her to appoint Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, but this would fly against all convention. That's because according to convention, the Prime Minister must fulfil one of two conditions. They must either be the leader of the largest party in the House, as Johson is, or able to command a majority in the House. What would normally happen in this instance would be that Johson would stay on as Prime Minister until Corbyn could demonstrate majority support in the Commons. If he couldn't, in most cases, there'll be an election to try and break the deadlock. Unfortunately, since the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which came out in 2011, the Prime Minister can no longer call an election without the support of Parliament. Parliament, as we've seen, doesn't want an election right now, so we're stuck. Basically, it looks like Johson literally can't resign. Again, this should be taken with a massive pinch of salt. No one really knows when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the UK's constitutional law, and maybe the Queen will decide to appoint Corbyn as Prime Minister despite it all, but it looks very unlikely, and that makes it very difficult to see what happens now. So those are the 8 outcomes. Unfortunately, none of them look ideal for Johson, but apparently, Dominic Cummings has been seen looking chipper around Westminster, So maybe there's a way out that we just haven't figured out yet. Before we wrap this up, I'd like to take a moment to shout out our podcast. Don't worry, I'm not going to play any clips of it in this video, but we did have a discussion about some of these potential options in yesterday's episode. So if you enjoyed this video, I think you might enjoy that episode of the podcast. There's a link to it down below. We will of course keep you updated on all of these options and what strategy Johson chooses in the future, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date when we release more videos. You can also hit the bell icon to get notified every time we release a video. If you want more from TLDR News, you can find us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And if you want your name featured at the end of videos just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.